that? Like, how do we get athletes off the ground when it comes to using poles, which can feel super fun?
So I think, I mean, a good place to start is what do poles do for a runner? And you know that, running is primarily a leg sport. We also know that in ultramarathon, leg fatigue is one of the main factors we're training to survive for the duration of the race. You get into some of the hillier, the more ascending, more descending types of races, and you're putting more fatigue and more eccentric contraction, more leg damaging work onto your legs. So poles are a means of switching some of that workload to the upper body. So it's important to note that like poles increase the energy cost of running. So right, if you go up a hill without poles and then you go up it with poles, it is more costly. It takes more calories, more oxygen, more work to get those poles up the hill with you. But it's less work on the legs. So the hope in an ultra endurance event is that by shifting some of that work from the legs to the arms, your legs don't crap out on you in the last 30 miles, the last 20 miles. So often the choice of whether to use poles or not is a factor of the terrain. If it's a flat course, Western States doesn't allow poles, but that's not a course most people would use poles for anyway. It doesn't have enough vert. Then you look at a race like a Speed Goat 50K. Some 50Ks, absolutely, you don't need poles. But then you add the vert component and maybe poles help. But then there's also an element of personal preference. So I'm sort of proud of being generally one of the faster guys with poles out there. Like I remember a couple years ago at San Juan Solstice, passing a guy and moving into the top 10. He was like, "Damn it, I got passed by an old guy with poles." Like I wasn't even that old at the time. It's just like there's this connotation that poles are for, old guys.
Yeah, that's a big difference between like European trail and ultra running, I think, and in the US too, is that there are less of us that are kind of year-round, quote-unquote, mountain athletes, i.e. using like skimo or Nordic skiing in the winter to balance out our running season in the spring and fall and summer. In Europe, I feel like most people gravitate towards that winter sport, and so it seems like a natural back and forth. So I think what I thought was really interesting about that was, okay, you've got this cost-benefit analysis, right? You've got athletes that, yes, poles should save your legs. I personally feel that way, but it is an energetic cost. Like, how do athletes start to make that decision? Does it just come down to personal preference? Like, what does that look like? Because I think that's the hard part when I work with these athletes from Texas or Michigan or Wisconsin, and they're trying to weigh out, do I use poles or not? Like, is it going to be practical for me if I don't feel efficient using poles?
And that's it. Again, there's no cut and dry answer. It's largely personal preference. And like the tricky thing is, for instance, like I do probably 85% of my running with poles. Granted, I don't like running flat places, so I just go to the hills and I run with poles. And if it's 15 or 20% grade or higher, I'm in a power hike mode. If it's that 8 to 15% kind of douchey grade, I might be scrunning, ski running, where you're still in a running motion, but you're also using your arms for a little bit of propulsion. And then if it's flat, I might not use my poles, but that's pretty rare. If I've got my poles out, I'm using them. I'm not someone who stashes them for parts of races. The other factor to consider is downhills. I did the old Gabe. I ended up doing the 30K last weekend instead of the 50K. And I was kind of shocked at the amount of people who were just carrying their poles on downhills. Because for me, like downhills is where you really save the impact on your legs. You can kind of just lean into the hill and take really quick steps and use your poles to lessen some of the that quad deadening impact. The tricky thing there is it's such a technical skill. It has to be practiced to the point of mastery before it becomes something you'd want to use. For instance, I've run with people who are trying to learn to use poles, and they trip themselves on the downhills, and that's obviously not an ideal scenario in a race to be taking yourself out, causing yourself to fall and potentially jeopardizing your finish. So then it's, do you want to use poles enough in your race to commit to the time and training it takes to get good enough at using them? So there's a bit of a catch-22 there.